Hello, everyone. GM. Welcome back to another episode of Overpriced JPEGs. It is your Friday recap episode where we are breaking down and talking about all of the things that have happened this week in the world of NFTs, the metaverse. We might get into some AI on this one, all of the above. And joining me for this recap episode is Gavin Purcell. He is the former producer for The Tonight Show, left fairly recently, and you may know him because he wrote a long blog post and Twitter post, I guess, about coming out as a secret degen. You had lived for many months or years as and on crypto Twitter, moonlighting as like a crypto person online while you lived out your fancy Hollywood producer life, Tonight Show producer life. And now you're fully one of us. I'm so excited to have you here. Thanks for joining the show, Gavin.
I'm so excited too. And just to be clear, I think my degen lifestyle started probably after I left the show because I would have the time to do it, but that's fine too. And also people may know me weirdly. What I found is, and just to touch on that big article, I wrote that article in part because my experience in this space has been so interesting, right? For positive and negative, and I want to kind of cover everything. But weirdly, like my other identity, quote unquote, is now known better in this space than I am, which is really interesting. So if anybody knows my real name in this space is Funky Donk, which I think most people actually who have seen me around in different Discords, obviously I've been a holder of a lot of the big projects and I'm a big fan, and also spend a lot of time on both sides of the spectrum in the NFT world. When I say that, I mean, I'm really interested in what the blue chips are doing and how they proceed and how they turn into big companies. But I'm also spending a lot of time on IC and all these places looking at the stuff that's minting rugs and not meaning to, the classic stuff that all of us do in this space. And then discovering some kind of cool gems too along the way. And part of what drives me in this space that's really interesting is I'm really fascinated by how art and commerce come together, right? To me, that's a really interesting thing. I'm really interested in the idea of collective ownership and what it means for a group of people to own something but not own it. And I think that's part of what I dug into in my longer piece. And then I'm also just really interested in the idea of community and what community can do and bring together, and have become a giant fan. We'll get into this, I think, today, talking about smaller communities within the space.
I love it. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, definitely, it is funny to have to introduce yourself both by your real name and your pseudonym. And this is why my parents think my job isn't real. I'm like, yeah, I was interviewing Funky Donk today. And they're like, your job, what? Your job is not real. You don't live in the real world, Carly. Like,
the funny thing is I picked that name randomly and I was like, oh, this sounds kind of funny. And then suddenly, like, a year and a half later, 2 years later, here I am now. People are calling me Funky all the time. And my kids hear it in the background when I'm on chats like this. And they're like, oh, hi, Funky. How's it going, Funky? Like, it's become this joke in my household. So it's pretty funny.
Do y'all realize what's happening over at Ledger? That the #1 leader in digital asset security has teamed up with Tony Fadell, builder of the iPod, to revolutionize the experience of owning digital assets securely. They're doing this with Ledger STAX. This is the most premium product to date, and it's so user-friendly. Ledger STAX is a palm-sized device with a new e-Ink 2 display on the cover and around the spine, meaning you can view and confirm transactions at a glance. You can also customize your ledger by displaying your favorite NFT on the cover, even when the device is off. Pair your new Ledger STAX with your Ledger Live to manage, earn, and hodl all your NFTs and over 500 coins. This space needs sleek user experiences, our iPod moment, and that's what Ledger has set out to do here without compromising their core promise of security. Keep your digital assets in the safest place they can be, a Ledger STAX wallet. Trust yourself with Ledger STAX and go to shop.ledger.com to pre-order your Ledger STAX now. They're shipping in April. And if you use the link in our show notes to pre-order now, you'll be helping the show as well. Thank you. Well, let's start here. I mean, you are a degen. How are you feeling about the market right now these days? What are you watching? This is usually how we kick off these episodes. So just want to get a vibe and sentiment check.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's better than it's been in a long time. I think that it feels healthy-ish. I think that, and when I say healthy, it's always so hard, right? I think people who have stuck through 2022 really felt bad in a lot of times. Like there were times where I really made a point of me sticking all the way through it, because in prior crypto cycles, and by the way, even other creative technology cycles, I'd kind of fallen out when stuff got bad. And I was like, oh, this sucks. And then I would walk away and I'd come back and it had bloomed into something really interesting. In fact, I even did that with NFTs because I was in it in kind of January of 2021. A good friend of mine, Brian Brinkman, who's an Art Blocks artist, he was actually weirdly our graphics artist on The Tonight Show. That's how he and I know each other.
Wow.
It's a fascinating story. But anyway, he got me into NFTs in January of 2021. And then I was really kind of interested then and then faded them in March of 2021 when the original OE movement happened. If you remember, there was a Nifty Gateway had all these OEs and it kind of took everything and then it all crashed. And so I missed apes, I missed cats, I missed all that stuff. And I came back in about August or September of 2021 and then kind of got deep on it. Now starting to feel a little bit better than it did to me in there. So the ways I look at 2022 are there was the moment that Luna hit, which was real bad, right? That was real bad. And that was like where I feel like a big Band-Aid was ripped off the market and a lot of people got scared and left. And then there was the moment that FBF hit, that FTX hit, which was another kind of Band-Aid. But the interesting thing is we had already kind of come so far down that the people who had stuck through that time felt like it was coalescing into something interesting. And then what I know I've heard you talk about this before, but like the end of last year started to feel weirdly better. And usually it doesn't happen till January. You know, there's always the cycle of like people sell off in December and come back in January. But it started to feel like December was bubbling in an interesting way. Some of the blue chips were talking about stuff. And it felt like a lot of people were holding things for this time, right? Which is kind of scary and interesting at the same point. But I feel better about the overall market than I have in a while. Whether or not it's sustainable, I think that's a big question. I think my worry about the market is that we're in what would be considered a bear market, bull market, right? Like,
like a dead cat bounce kind of a thing where
exactly. Well, I don't even know if it's a dead cat bounce because I think we're at the bottom, but I think or it's close to the bottom, but I don't think it's going to be the shoot up that everybody may be expecting right now. And I think I'm a little tentative about it, but I feel like there's cool stuff happening again, which makes me excited. So that's the long answer, if that makes sense.
I love it. Well, I want to get your before we dive into the biggest topics of the week. I want to get your thoughts on some of these metas, like the open edition. We've been talking about it on the show, but I know you've got a particular take on it. But before we go into open editions writ large, I have one specific open edition I would like to say a couple words about, which is the OPJ open edition, the OPJ NFT. If you are listening to this the day this launches, this episode comes out Friday morning, January 27th. This is the last day to buy your OPJ NFT. We are closing the mint after today. And I just want to first of all say thank you so much to everyone who has participated in this mint. I so genuinely have been blown away by it. My partner on it, Kit Kodak, we did an episode together last week. And truly, like when we were conceptualizing this and launching it, we were hoping to sell 250. And I've been very clear about, like, I've tried to not overmarket the thing. I've tried to be very clear about what this means. It's gin, it's events. And so we were like 250, that'd be great. And, we're at basically 1,000 now. I will say we actually only have like 1,300 of these. We didn't even think we'd come close. We were calling it an open edition. I don't know if folks are going to come at me for being mad at that. So this will tap out at 1,300 if we sell that many. So go grab them for the last day. And also, before it's a race with the clock, I guess. Will we sell 1,300 or will we sell, or will the mint close first? So that's the first thing. Thank you for all of you who have supported me. It's incredible. And we've got some fun stuff, as people know, some events, some gin. And on that note, our very first live event, the event that is kicking off what we are calling the Overpriced Happy Hour Tour in 2023, is going to be in Miami. We're working on dates because it's somewhat venue dependent. We're looking at March 31st right now, but we're going to dovetail it. We're trying to dovetail it with NFT Miami. And our very first guest is going to be Julian Holguin, CEO of Doodles. You know him. You maybe love him. Maybe right now you hate him. Lots of stuff going on with Doodles. People might have mixed reactions, but if you hold an OPJ NFT, you will have the opportunity to grab a ticket for that event. We are going to be live together in Miami. Great conversation, interviewing him for 45 minutes, whatever it might be, 15 minutes plus of questions, and then we'll mingle, we'll hang out, you'll get to meet folks. And with that, my camera just went out. Good Lord.
I was wondering about that. Wow.
If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm sorry. We're going to fix my camera in just a moment. If you're listening on a podcast, you don't know what I'm talking about anyway, so it doesn't matter. Julian Holguin is our very first guest, and I'm really excited about this. And that should give you a sense of the kind of folks that we are going to have throughout this tour. And again, OPJ NFT holders are the folks who are going to be able to redeem for tickets and attend these events in person. You'll be given first priority. And more details on exactly how that mechanism is going to work, but really excited. Thank you to Julian. And our open edition is closing. Okay, so with that fun announcement out of the way, and I'm doing, by the time this airs, I'll be doing a Twitter space on Friday to talk more about it and answer folks' questions. But thank you for sitting with me here, Gavin, while I gave that announcement and update. And let's talk open editions in general. I know you've been following Jack Butcher's Checks open edition, which we talked a little bit about last week. What do you think of this meta right now, and what artists are doing?
So, first of all, congratulations on all your stuff. That's awesome. I think that it's a really interesting thing to me right now. What I'm seeing is the gamification of art, which I think is kind of cool and also interesting in that, like, I'm not 100% sold that it's sustainable, but I like the idea that artists are being able to kind of like turn their art into something that feels like it fits with the market, if that makes sense. Because I think that in the past, open editions were just like a really cool way to get essentially what was a print of something, right? Like when I say that, I mean, imagine a world where you can own an original piece of art versus a print, right? Prints are often cheaper because they're mass produced, but you still get to hang the person's art in your home. And I think that in the past, when you had an open edition, generally something would mint out at a price and the value opportunity would not be that great because, you know, there's so many of them and people would buy them and then eventually the price would go down. So when you're looking at it from a price perspective, it was never the greatest investment opportunity. And that's not to say that this is about investment because everybody has different reasons to buy NFTs and why they do. What I think is interesting about this OE movement, and Jack Butcher started it, and then I think there's a lot of other people that are kind of coming into it. The Nyan Cat, Chris, the Nyan Cat guy is doing one right now that's doing very well. I can never pronounce this guy's name, but there's a guy named Lucer, I think is his name. He's an artist who's done one that's doing really well. It's got like a floor of 0.5 right now. And each of these is based on the idea that an open edition came out, and then they're going to burn it to create another piece of art, right? Now, ultimately, you're creating a gamification of the way of doing this, right? Because and they kind of become fungible tokens in a weird way, right? Like unlike non-fungible tokens where every single one is individual, you're talking about these as being kind of the same thing that get used in almost like a DeFi mechanics way where they're going to get burned for a new thing. I think that I'm not 100% sold that in the long run it's sustainable. What I like about what Jack's doing is at least he started this kind of movement and it feels like a significant art thing. Like it does feel like, oh, this is something new. And a lot of artists are getting paid, right? Which is great. Like I think that the Lucer one, if I remember right, minted like 8,000 and it was like a decent payday for him like that.
Yeah, it was like really, it was in like 15 seconds. It was Lucer's that was like really fast. It was
I think so. Yeah.
8,000 in like under a minute. And it was like, you know, whatever he made on it.
Yeah. And I think the good news is for somebody like that is it allows them to like produce art for a long time, which I'm a huge fan of. And I think that's great. Whether or not the meta, as you know, metas come and go in this space. Right. And there's a storytelling meta that had a real big moment with goblins and then kind of like in Wagdai and kind of faded out eventually. I think it's interesting. And I think one thing to take away from this is just following metas is a really interesting way to look at these markets, right? Like when you're deep in the middle of it and you can see something come up, you have the opportunity to kind of like watch it go up and down, and everything's a cycle, right? I say this all the time to people, like people who have said, I'm a huge fan of what Goblin Town did and how they kind of came out and they created this thing. But then the people got mad because price went down, right? This is the common refrain of all sorts of NFTs. And I think that you have to see some of this stuff as seasonal. And when I say that, I mean, like I saw Goblin Town as a seasonal thing, which is like, it's almost like a show, right? Where a show doesn't live forever. No show goes on forever other than maybe the Simpsons, right? And the Simpsons at some point will go away too. But most shows have a curve to them, right? They build an audience, they get really big, and sometimes that audience goes to the very end and then the show gets canceled or goes away because the storytelling has run out. I think that's the way that NFT metas kind of work too. So it really depends. If you're looking at it from an investment standpoint, getting in early on metas is always a useful thing. If you're not looking at it from an investment standpoint, you just want to support artists, this is a great way to do it as well. So that's my kind of take on where stuff is with this.
I think your season analogy, your TV show analogy is actually great because I think the other piece that they share is then these shows come back, right? We're now doing that 90s show and it's like, feels like all we make now is revivals of old shows. Yeah. And I think the advantage that folks who are here during this period and have been here for the last year have is that they are getting early exposure to all sorts of metas that are absolutely going to come back down the line. And I see all of these things, the free meta, the open edition meta, the burn meta. I actually think those are two almost connected, obviously, but separate things, are all levers you can pull as a creator. Brands can leverage these things. Everybody can leverage these kind of things. And I think what's interesting is we've seen this evolution a little bit where you really had the open meta start at the end of last year. You had artists who were doing this around the holidays. I think it didn't XCopy do one. And, OPJ started, in mid-December, our open edition. Zeneca did one right before then. So you had that start early. And then you said this, I think this is right, like the Damien Hirstian mechanism of this burn, and you have to make a decision between, burning, keeping, getting something new, physical, digital. I feel like Jack really brought back doing the open edition plus that, and now you're seeing that kind of take off. So you can mix and match and play with these things. And again, I think there's obviously a lot of relevance to it for artists, and that's where we're seeing it play out. But it's relevant for brands. There's so many different folks who could play with something like this.
I mean, again, every different way to kind of make things interesting is important, right? Like one of the things I think that's really that people don't do enough in this space. And when you talk about brands, I think they're really mostly pretty bad at it still.
Yeah,
they don't understand. We'll talk about I don't think they tap into the knowledge that's here. Right? Like, totally. I think that one thing that doesn't happen, and by the way, I'm somebody that's worked with a lot of brands and I know how those relationships work, right? Like I, have done many sorts of integrations at television shows, and it's really hard because brands are often run by an agency, and the agency is telling the brand they know what they're doing when a lot of times they don't, right? And I think that the brand companies need to really dive into it. We'll get into this later when we talk about Porsche, but the brands need to better understand the market. And I think what you're talking about is trying to see these metas. There are people here who know this stuff. By the way, also, I think some of the larger projects need to understand the market better too. And I think that's something that also needs to kind of cross over. I think that in general, if there's somebody on your team who isn't spending every day doing the kind of degen lifestyle, you're missing out, because that's where the actual world of NFTs happen to start with, right? Like that's where you learn about the things that are going on. It's the same as if you were this is a bad sports analogy, but if you're a fan of football, you would rather have somebody who's played the game and understands the basics of it rather than just hire somebody who's never been part of it in the first place. So I think that's kind of when I'm saying what in that analogy, it's like there's a coach and there's all this other stuff, but it gets confusing. But I'm just saying, really at my heart, there are people who are in this world who spend every day living it, breathing it in and out, who will help those bigger companies or brands understand the actual flux in and out of what's going on. And I don't think they're being tapped into enough.
I appreciate the baseball metaphor, because we're actually doing a bit of a sports month here at Overpriced JPEGs. We're not necessarily carrying it into our recap episodes, but in the interviews we're doing this month, it's all centered around, in some way, tangentially or directly, the intersection of sports and NFTs. So that worked very well.
Oh, good.
I totally agree. I think my only caveat, and again, not to overtalk this before we even get into Porsche, but I think brands absolutely should have somebody who's living the degen lifestyle. But I think that can be construed to mean you need to be marketing to degens, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the key is, it's taking the insights, taking the open edition, taking the ethos, and then figuring out how to make it endemic to and fit your brand and your audience. And this is where I get frustrated, is I think that brands are still, I don't know, you just get the vibe that they're still just seeing dollar signs and saying, oh, there's a bunch of people with money, and so we're just going to try to talk to them, instead of saying, no, let's adopt this technology for our consumers and our business. So we'll get more into that. I also want to talk, as we're at the top here, and just things that you were thinking about. I know you'd mentioned you're really enjoying these small private discords.
Yep.
And I don't know exactly what you're thinking here. So I want you to explain to me what you're tracking and what you think is working for some of the projects you're in with these small private Discord.
Okay, so here's my take. So I've been in Discord since, like I said, March or June. I guess like it really got into it early in January 2021, but then kind of dove in deep in August 2021. And originally Discords were all kind of organized around project, right? You were like, one of my first big projects was Anonymize, and I'm still in the Anonymized Discord. And like, that's a project Discord where you're in and you're a big part of it. What I have found is happening, and I think is really healthy in general, is that more of my interesting Discord conversations are coming around smaller groups of people that have coalesced in different places for different reasons, right? So there's a couple of small private Discords I'm in. One is called Midcurve, which are friends of mine that are real investor trader guys, and it's been a really smart place to be. And those guys, are people who come from the financial world or they come from other places, and they brought me in because I have an interest in this stuff, but I'm not an expert. And our group kind of is an interesting kind of combination of people. Then I'm in another group that's based on a weekly spaces I do called Keeping NFTs Weird, which is really almost all artists. And Poof from EtherOrcs is a friend of mine. He runs it. We have all these really cool people in there who are really focused, including 113 and all these people that are doing really interesting technical and art stuff. That's a totally separate conversation for me, right? That's a different part of my brain that I want to talk about in NFTs. And I think, and there's another one that's great, Midnight Labs, which is run by Giancarlo, who's a YouTuber and has put together this really interesting small group of people that kind of slowly expands. Ultimately, it's an NFT group, but it isn't really. It's more of like a creative builders group. So to me, when you're in a Discord for a project, so much of the conversation ends up being about that project, right? And one of the things that's actually great about the Mice Discord for me is that this moved completely on from that. Because if you don't know the history of Mice, like Mice came out in September of 2021, shot up to 13 ETH, and then kind of crashed down pretty quickly because it was in the real heart of the original bull run, right? The people that have stuck around through that are all people that there's probably 150 to 200 active people in that Discord. They've all become friends of mine, and we don't even talk about the project very often at all. And I think that's the kind of small Discord groups that will matter. I think if you go into a Discord now, project Discords, in the very beginning, it's always about like, what's your launch strategy, what you're doing, and there's a lot of people in there obviously talking about floor, right? If it can kind of stay through that, it can kind of transform into a slightly different group, but I think it's still always going to be focused on the project. And I think to me, what's interesting is the conversations around multiple things and seeing how people cross over. My whole life has always been about crossover in that way, and I think that's really important to me.
What's your recommendation here? Because I can imagine people are sitting here being like, well, congratulations, Gavin, you were the producer on The Tonight Show and you get to hang out with other cool people in Discord. You know what I mean? Like, is this something you think projects could actually adapt themselves in some capacity where they're like, you know what, we're going to either launch a new Discord or we're going to make a really intentional effort to shift the conversation in Discord to be, I think an alpha group is putting it too strongly, but like a general conversational group where there's high quality conversation about the space going on. What's your recommendation for folks?
Okay, well, I think there's two different ways to look at this. One to me is if you're a person who's in this space, whether or not you're a project creator or not, you should go look for people like you, right? I believe this in any creative field. I think if you're in television, if you're in media, if you're anything, you need to find people that are like you and feel like you have connective tissue. So to me, that's like, I believe like if you're in a group of people in a project, say you're in something big like Moonbirds or Doodles, and these I think both have done this, people will break off and create their own private groups because they're people who find connection with each other, right? Like that's the beauty of community. You can find connections with specific people, and those private Discords will suit your need for whatever you want. When it comes to projects themselves, I am a giant fan of trying to break people into separate rooms and make sure that people feel that they can connect with whatever you're trying to do there, right? If you're a community person in a large project, your job is to make people feel comfortable and to make people feel like they can be part of a community and not feel bad for being there. And I also think the hardest thing about this whole world is you have to do everything you can to not make it be about price, right? Because the entire world of what we do in this world is there's a label on it and you can go see it every day, and it makes you feel either smart or dumb based on where you bought into it. And I think that is a really screwed up thing to our brains. And I think if you can make people feel that it's about something more than price, that's how you succeed in the community world. Now, will it succeed in the long term as a project? I don't know, because one of my biggest problems with this world is if you're a founder in this space, so much of what you do is going to be based on the collective group and how they decide to either buy or sell your NFT, because that's what ultimately is the price of the thing. So the more, in my mind, the more that you can like create something that can live outside of that is really important.
Absolutely. I love that. And I can agree in that I am in a couple, it's actually more Telegram chats now. I'm in some private Telegram chats that I think are high signal to noise, great conversation, more intimate. And, not to bring it back to OPJ NFT, but with this live tour, in my own way, that was sort of what I had in mind, was, dovetailing with these conferences, but trying to create a space that feels more like the private Telegram or private Discord channel, where it's a high signal to noise conversation happening in a slightly more intimate setting than a big conference setting, where you can really get to know each other and maybe participate in the conversation that's happening up on stage a little bit more. I think conferences, sometimes you have like the big auditorium and a panel up there, or these like smaller project-based, to your point, like hangouts. But the blending of discussion with the hangout is something we're looking to create with these live events we're doing. So thanks for giving me a great segue to just go back to talking about OPJ.
Plug yourself.
Yeah, plug myself in the tour. Okay, let's get into some of the news of the day. I think we start with Doodles, again, since we mentioned Julian earlier, and just a number of big announcements coming out of Doodles, starting with their acquisition of the Golden Wolf animation studio, and then maybe segueing us into what's happening with Doodles 2. You have the Flow announcement. You have also the fact that Doodles 2 OG holders aren't getting to participate in Doodles 2. You need to have, they are, but you need to have a duplicator or a Genesis box. So those are the pieces of news.
Which technically, by the way, they all could get originally, and some of them might have sold it, right? Like that's that whole side of things.
Correct. Yeah. So let's talk about that in a second. Let's start with Golden Wolf. I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this. You have this background in the entertainment world, and are a great guest to weigh in on what you think of the Golden Wolf acquisition.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I have, in general, positive feelings about what Doodles is and how they built themselves, right? Like I was a Doodles holder pretty early on. I think I bought one at 1 ETH, and I don't hold them now. But I am a big fan of how they built their brand and what they've done. I think buying an animation studio is really smart for them based on what I've heard and what I think is their ambitions and where they want to go. I think that here's the one thing I'll say about Doodles, and I think this is a big problem. I really think their comms are not amazing, and I think they've got to figure this out. Like I don't know if you saw when they announced their Flow blockchain stuff, which we can talk about too. It was a couple big blocks of text in a tweet, right? And like, when would be a better time to use your incredible ability to show that you are art focused, that you are animation focused, that you are mainstream, to find some way to kind of produce that information and kind of prove out your point that this is what you want to be. Now, that said, I mean, I'm not going to dismiss the fact, and what they bought is a legitimate animation studio, and I am a believer that like they could expand their IP in a major way doing that stuff. And like, I think that they're connected well in the Hollywood space now, which is smart for somebody like that. Obviously, Pharrell's involved, and they have all these other things going on. But it's a good example of like the kind of trickiness of trying to figure out what does it look like to take a purely Web3 brand, even though they've announced their intentions from an early point, and to try to kind of make a mainstream brand out of it, and like where those struggles can kind of exist. The thing, again, that I feel like is tricky is Doodles is a Web3 specific brand. It started in Web3. It's not a Web2 brand coming to Web3. And there are times where I feel like they're failing to do the communication to the people in Web3 in the right way. Does that make sense? Like it feels like it doesn't.
Oh yeah. That is the central tension clearly for Doodles. That is the central struggle, is honor and make your OG holders feel good while broadening. And they've almost like defiantly, almost like middle finger style, declared over and over again that they are shooting bigger than just the original community. And let's get to that in a minute. I want to take this systematically. So I want to talk about the Golden Wolf thing. I have a bunch of thoughts, and some of which I've shared on the show, but on the communication point that you're making. Starting with the Golden Wolf thing, I think this is great. So Golden Wolf, they're, as far as I understand it, like a very respected animation studio. I know other big NFT projects have actually either worked with them or they've commissioned, they're like, been one of the animation studios, like in consideration for other big NFT projects, animation stuff. They were sort of ancillarily involved, and they did some of the Rick and Morty animations. I know, like, just a high degree of respect for them, as far as I understand it. It's also a no-brainer, and the seeds of this were there from early days. I interviewed Poopie over a year ago now, or maybe it was a year ago exactly. I guess it was early 2022. And I remember at that point he was talking about like vertically integrating their manufacturing any manufacturing they do, like we want to have complete control, top to bottom of anything that is Doodles, that we can make sure it's to our exacting standards or whatever, right? It was a point about quality and sustainability and whatever else. And this just fits in perfectly with that. Like, hey, we want to have such an integrated brand where from top to bottom, it aligns with our brand values and holistically whatever, that we can control the whole thing. So I think it's exciting. I was also excited to see them talking about Golden Wolf coming on. Obviously, they're having conversations with all different sorts of Hollywood players for, I'm sure, longer form TV or Netflix or whatever those deals are that are in the works, but also for social content. And folks who have followed this podcast closely know I'm very bullish and excited about incubating content on social as a low cost, all relative, right? Lower cost, lower lift way to get yourself that Netflix deal. It's why I'm excited about what Women in Weapons is doing, which I've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast. And so that seems like a no-brainer and a very cool thing. And Ingi, let me get this name right. Ingi Erlingsson, that is a Scandinavian ass name. Ingi Erlingsson is coming on as their chief content officer. He was the CEO of Golden Wolf. He's now coming on. Last thing I'll say on this Golden Wolf thing, I don't know if you saw any of the tweet threads or reactions from people who clearly are in the animation space who were fan of Golden Wolf, who don't know anything about Doodles.
Yes, I did see this.
People were mad.
Yeah.
This is one of those moments where I'm like, I break outside of my bubble for a second and I'm watching all these animators like enraged and horrified.
Yeah.
And it reminds me like what reputational damage we have done, we have wrought, it has been done, whatever the case may be, to the concept of NFTs. I mean, these animators were so disgusted. And I'm looking at what they're saying and I'm like, you don't even know what this technology is. Like, you literally do not know what this is. And it's just fascinating. So I don't know if you have thoughts there.
Well, I was going to say is like, I come up through the gaming world a little bit too, right? I've been a gamer my whole life. I worked at a company called G4 for a long time, which is a network about video games. The gaming world is very similar, right? And I think that in part it's because the narrative got too crazy around what it was, right? I think that when NFTs blew up in 2021, the narrative was it was a money-making scheme and that you were selling JPEGs for a lot of money, right? And then it all crashed. And I think the narrative, like everybody was like, check, narrative, well, I was right, you know what I mean? And I think that the other thing that, so when I talk about the video game world, I think you talk about gamers and you talk about pixel artists in that world who are very mad about this stuff. And in that world, I think you talk about the idea that animators just see other people making money on what is art. And I think in part, they just think this is a way of making this feel cheap. It's a way of making the whole world of what we do look bad. And I think Doodles is going to have to deal with this as they try to mainstream, right? Because this is the tricky thing about starting as a Web3 brand and going into the mainstream. Now, one thing I think what you're talking about here is I think that Doodles could, like Azuki, by the way, too, I think both of those companies can make really interesting animated projects. And if they have something that's successful that, you know, a kid might tune into, or maybe let's say with Azuki, I think making an anime is really smart because anime has such a broad range of interests and can do sort of things. If they can make something like that, that opens the door to a whole new audience without even knowing about the Web3 part of it, that's a massive win, right? Like, that's a massive win. I think the mainstream is going to struggle with what it means to be a Web3 company and how all these feelings they built up over the last 2 years, or maybe even longer in the crypto world, are going to reflect back against that. And I think that's going to be something that these companies are going to have a hard time with. And I don't have to say they can't succeed, but I just think it's going to be a tricky thing.
I do occasionally, like when I see things like the reaction to the Golden Wolf news, I do, like, I'm so bullish on this technology, and I think there's so many the applications for cross-brand collaboration and loyalty programs. And I just recorded a whole podcast before you and I hopped on that was talking all about that, and I'm just so confident in that as a no-brainer use for this technology. But like, I have these moments where I'm like, is the reputation just so bad that the great use cases of this, well, just like we won't be able to overcome the damage that has been done to us reputationally? Anyway, obviously I'm still here, so I don't think that I'm building a whole company around this. But last thing on the Golden Wolf thing that I thought was interesting is, I'm going to read this off a little bit. So Doodles will leverage Golden Wolf's strategic partnership with creative studio PsyOp to launch a joint venture called Active Ingredient. Active Ingredient will aim to reinvent storytelling and the tools used to make them a reality using advancements in AI, blockchain technology. I interpreted this to mean that Doodles is thinking about even just beyond the Doodles brand, how can Doodles, who understands Web3, understands the technology, launch and make money on other studio, like doing projects for even outside of the world of Doodles. PsyOp is, and it's actually a very clever name, right? It's a branded content studio, essentially. It seems like they make compelling content, but they're trying to persuade or get you to buy a product or something like that. So I thought that was really interesting as well. And there was a period of time in which this space was obsessed with alternative revenues once we realized royalties are not necessarily entirely sustainable for a couple of reasons. And this just seems like an interesting path that Doodles is going down along those lines.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that people are going to be opening up to, and I think this may be part of the FUD from the community itself, right, is in order to sustain, these companies have to be companies, right? Like, and a company being a company can't just be about the 5 to 10,000 holders of your original thing, because that's such a small audience, right? And like the hardest thing is when you have those 5 to 10,000, or maybe even smaller, depending on how many holders there are, and their thought is first, hey, I invested in this thing, and I don't want to see this go down. I want to see you bringing value back to this thing. Whereas the company itself has to think, well, how do we make money and how do we sustain? Like that is through growth. You have to grow, right? And sometimes the growth is going to come in a way that may not benefit the original holders. And this is where the in-between of collective ownership really gets funky, because if it's a collective ownership, but really you don't own it, right? What you own is a representation of what they've made first. You don't have a piece of the company. You have a piece of something, but because you publicly own it and you can talk about it, the company itself has a weird relationship with you, because suddenly the company itself is listening to people who own part of it but don't really own it. And that's where everything gets super funky. I think that I hope that we can see companies like Azuki and Doodles, and I think those are kind of the two first possible big breakouts that could kind of go wide. I want one of them to have a major success on a mainstream level, meaning that without even knowing what the Web3 angle is, they have a hit, right? And especially because I think Azuki and Doodles are both focused on IP generation.
Absolutely.
If one of them has a hit, and when I say a hit from the TV parlance or the media parlance, I mean like, if Doodles makes a cartoon series or even a small social series that gets picked up, if lots of people watch it and love it and they don't know anything about the Web3 thing, that will mean it's succeeded. Because then you can still feed back into the Web3 thing and it become part of a broader ecosystem. I think if they don't have that, it's going to be really tricky. So I think, and hit-driven businesses are hard, but I think they have a shot.
I have so many thoughts in response to that, and I will not be able to get them all out at once because I only have one mouth in which to say things from. But this is great to get us to kind of part two. So we talked about Golden Wolf. Part two here is the announcement about Flow, which we can get into, but that also is where you were talking about this comm strategy piece. I think there is no doubt that Doodles has struggled with the communication stuff, and that their holders are just aggrieved and have felt aggrieved for a very long time. And I have historically been quite defensive of Doodles, and I still, frankly, am, in the sense that I think it is entirely acceptable and potentially even laudable for a company to say very point blank, we are trying to go wide, we are trying to appeal to mass audiences, and we are trying to build the next Disney, and you are holders of original collectibles. Think of yourselves as the holders of the original Mickey Mouse, and give us 20 years to try and make this thing a reality, and like that's what it is. And I genuinely think that is legitimate, and I think they've said that early enough that people who have been coming in the last 8 months, 10 months, whatever the number of months is, should understand that they've been pretty damn clear about that. Mm-hmm. Now, with that said, do I think there's room for you could be a little better? I don't think this has to be so all one or the other. And this is where I can shed a little light into, I know as of, I think a month ago, they had 11 employees. I mean, they were such a small team. They've now made a recent slew of hires, including my good friend Austin Hurwitz, who's their head of business development and things. But 11 people is tiny to be running a multi-million dollar, $100 million, over $600 million valued brand or whatever. And I think they were trying to be very intentional about their hires, which is fantastic. But I also think that has fed some of these problems, is just a complete lack of bandwidth. And sure, you can fault them for, I guess, not hiring faster or not whatever, but I tend to be defensive of them, of all right, they're trying to make some really intentional choices here, and and that has made it very hard to, like, I'm like, just send out a tweet. Like, I was always defensive of them when people were like so mad they weren't tweeting. I'm like, it's been a month. Relax, guys. Like, they're not rugging me. But I did feel like, just send a tweet out. Like, do you know what I mean? Like,
I will say, this is my thing about that, is that it was at the worst possible time in the market. And I think this is where it goes to what I was saying earlier, is that you have to be attuned to what's going on with the people on the ground. It's the same way, like when I was a TV producer, like I really wanted to hear from people who were watching shows, or even just talking to them about what they're watching in general, because that's where you get a sense of where things are happening. My thing about the tweet thing was always, hey, you guys, this is one of the biggest teams, or maybe not biggest team based on this, but like one of the biggest projects in the space. Your job in part, and I know this may suck, but your job when you did this, you launched this, is to kind of take care of this community, right?
Yeah.
And taking care of the community, you may not be able to control the floor price. Nobody can, right? Because there's other people who are going to dump stuff, or they're going to do something. The one thing you can do is like communicate clearly and really what's going on with what your thing is. And I think that I don't know what the time length was, but I know it was like a really long time before they even tweeted about stuff.
It was like a month and a half, which it is a long time. And on the other hand, is like, okay, it was a month. They didn't tweet. They're like, people are like, it's a rug. I'm like, guys, you need to relax.
Well, definitely was never going to be a rug. But to me, 2 days is too long not to tweet for that company. 1 day is too long. They should have multiple conversations where they're engaging with the people that are doing stuff. And this is where, like, I feel the Web3 thing and what I learned growing up, because I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I won a couple Emmys at the show I was at, the Tonight Show, because I was really good at understanding the early times of social media and what you have to do. And one of the biggest things with social media that has now become a cliche, but is authenticity and connective tissue, right? You have to feel like people are there and you're part of something. You feel like it's something interesting, and it's the easiest lever to pull. I mean, and you talk about bringing people on, like there are people who are really good at this that you don't have to pay a lot of money, that would have been a simple thing to do. And it would have made people feel better about your brand. Like it just feels to me like one of the biggest things I've seen in this space, in the kind of world that I come from, that felt like a big fail. Like why? It just didn't make sense to me. And it felt like what you're saying is it kind of feels like this middle finger thing. And I don't think that's their intention, but
no.
but it does feel that way at times. And I think that's where people have to kind of come around on it.
And for me to then play devil's advocate and take the other side of this, and I'll use this specific example. So you've also had this announcement about holding an original doodle does not get you access to Doodles 2 inherently. Yeah. You need to have a duplicator and or a Genesis box. And Poopie tweeted that out. He said unpopular clarification and then explained that. People were really mad in the comments, and somebody was like, a case study on how to not drive value back to your OG holders or whatever. Yeah. And Poopie's response, which let me pull it up here, I think has some legitimacy, which is like, you got like, first of all, if you held an OG doodle, you were airdropped a duplicator. Now, okay, I understand some people have come in since then, and I have some sympathy for that, certainly, right? So duplicators were a claim for every doodler. In Doodles 2 OGs, you can sell your rights to certain traits, right? That people can use in the duplicator. So you'll be able to like basically lease out traits of your original doodle for people to create Doodles 2. They're like, we've spent nearly $10 million on best in class IRL activations for holders. Obviously, floor price limited metric, but is up tremendously from where they minted. Like, to act like this is not a company who has certainly driven some value back to holders is like, I think the narrative can get out of whack around that.
100%. I think that, and I also say that the announcement to me that the duplicators are what's going to push the other stuff, and that original doodles may not get access to that. Original Doodles did get a duplicator, right? Like, and I think this goes back to that idea of like, well, if you flipped it, you know, it's the same thing weirdly with Moonbirds and Oddities, right? Like that argument that like, sure, it's an airdrop and it's money, but it also like is part of the ecosystem. And if you're buying into the ecosystem in part, you have to be there. I just think that the hard thing is, again, this goes back to like, you know, and I don't envy Poopie because these are hard things to deal with. I think in part they might have gotten bigger pushback because of what I just mentioned earlier.
And you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There's already this feeling, there's already this impression, and they are doing nothing to be extra sensitive to the fact that that impression exists. Okay, let's final thing here. We've mentioned the Flowbook thing. We haven't talked about it. I have to eat words here. Nobody's going to remember this, so I don't know why I'm outing myself as having gotten this wrong. I really didn't think they were going to end up going on Flow. And when this was first a conversation and a debate, I don't know, last year, whenever it was first a conversation and debate, I was definitely in the camp of go for IMX, go for Polygon, go for something that's on ETH. Don't break up your IP across multiple chains. It just seems like a weird play for me. I think since then, I'm really into Cryptoys, which is on Flow. They obviously have a big Ticketmaster deal. Like I do think Flow has at least established some partnerships that certainly branch them out from just the NFL all day or the Top Shot stuff that I feel like obviously was their original calling cards, in a way that I get it. Like they are really trying to set out a niche as we will make the onboarding process easy for you. I also think, based on what I know about what Cryptoys is doing, Flow is putting in work around how do you make things kind of family friendly chains, right? How do you get a kid's wallet set up? How do you do things that can make this easy for families? And clearly that is the Doodles brand. And that's why I think they have a higher ceiling than a Yuga Labs or a Bored Ape, because that is clearly not a family-friendly brand. And
wait, you mean the Dookie Dash? Dookie Dash is not a family-friendly brand? Riding through the butthole.
What am I thinking? Dicks on a community like urinal board is not family-friendly. So I think I'm less negative on it now than I was when the debate was first raging. Do you have any thoughts on this?
It's really hard to say. I read a really good thread by Pranksy yesterday about this, and Pranksy is obviously an amazing OG NFT trader buyer, and I'm a big fan of them, and I think they've done some incredible support for the NFT community, and they are a very large owner of Doodles, and they made that clear. And I think in their thread, there was a really interesting thing, which was kind of the idea, and this gets into a little bit of what we were talking about in terms of decentralized versus centralized situations and safety and all sorts of other things. And I have not had a lot of experience with the Flow blockchain, to be honest with you, because I kind of completely missed Top Shot, in part on purpose, but in part because it just felt like, to me, I'd seen that game before. Like it felt like things that I'd seen in my past that was going to be a bubble, and already, obviously there's bubbles all over the place. I understand also, I think Poopsie comes from Dapper, right, which is involved with Flow, and I think that there's
founded
definitely
Flow. I mean, he was on the original, the team that founded Flow. Came out of Axiom Zen, and
So in my mind, there's something about that connective tissue that's probably really useful to them.
Yeah.
I also, like you, would have preferred to see them be somewhere on ETH, because I just am a much bigger believer in that ecosystem, and I think honestly Polygon is doing pretty incredible stuff right now. I'd like to see them scale, because it's going to take a lot of work to scale to their ambitions. But there's things on Polygon that I think are working really well. The safety part I get. And I think we just talked about this before we got on here, about some of the stuff that happened with Kevin Rose and Moonbirds recently, about the hacks and stuff. I think the social engineering things, all that stuff does have an argument for a centralized blockchain. Personally, one of the things that's interesting to me about this entire space is the decentralization nature of it. And so I dislike seeing people go to centralized blockchains for that reason. But again, this goes back to what is Doodles' ambition, right? Do they want to be at a place where they are able to onboard people in the simplest, easiest way? Flow is probably going to be much easier for that. So I guess that's my take on it. I'm not a giant fan of the choice, but I understand why they made it.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. I think, to me, it's one thing to decide where you're going to put your project, but this has double ramifications. It's not just where you're putting your project; it's also you're now splitting your project, and that's a little strange to me. But it'll be interesting to see how it really plays out, and is maybe a good example of just full interoperability, cross-chain future, or whatever. I mean, you in some ways have it with DGODs and Utes, obviously bridging over from Solana to ETH and Polygon. Of course, Doodles is not saying they're bringing OG Doodles over to Flow,
right.
But we can see. We'll see how it all plays out.
By the way, quick shout out on that, real fast. Pudgy Penguins is another interesting project in that way. And just to be honest, I do own Pudgies, but they just announced that they're bridging little Pudgies to multiple chains, and I think there is going to be a movement towards that, where you're going to see projects try to bring multiple chains into the mix, and I think that will open the door to other people being able to participate in that stuff.
I need to talk to Luca. Luca,
yes,
who now
should.
runs Pudgy. He DM'd me, and we've been texting a little bit. We've been trying to find a time, so I need to get him on the show at some point. No brainer. Last thing I'll say on this Doodles thing, we're running a little long in this episode already. I'm like, 15 minutes has gone by? Okay, cool. We've got only 7,000 more topics to get to. Doodles... Decentraland tweeted this out, and it's something I've said previously, so or roughly said, which is, Doodles shouldn't be trying to be Disney. They should be trying to be Minions. And I do think Minions is a really good example of like a more modern, updated, less IP proprietary IP. And I've said this before on the podcast, but for anybody who missed it, there was a great article. I think the Wall Street Journal also did an article on this, but even before that, there was like a more niche entertainment publication that really looked at how loose Minions is with enforcing their IP and their copyright protections versus something like Disney, who's very, very strict about enforcing it. And that what the result of that is you've seen a proliferation of Minions characters everywhere, like party balloon stores or like in memes and in your GIFs. And like, there's just like, you will go long stretches of time without running into Mickey Mouse. Of course, Mickey Mouse is so old and so iconic, it does not matter. But you'll go a far shorter period of time without running into some sort of Minions reference somewhere on the internet or in the real world. And in the attention economy, if you're launching a new brand, there's something to be said for that. So I just wanted to flag that. I thought that was a good point by Degentraland that, again, we've talked about on the show before. Okay, let's not do Cairo just yet. I know you mentioned him and the hack, but I feel like we have to make sure we cover this Porsche NFTs saga as we talk about brands and how they need to be doing things in this world. All right, I guess I'm sure everybody who's listening to this is fairly familiar with what happened. Porsche launched their NFTs. They sold them for 0.911. It was a reference to the makes of one of their cars. But in light of the disaster that was their Mint, I almost feel like it's more like a call 911 joke. I haven't seen any of those online, but I've like...
That's pretty good. You should definitely tweet that.
There should be. Somebody needs to make this reference. Call 911, Porsche's dying or whatever. I'm kidding. But yeah, so and they were trying to sell 7,500 of them. They sold 1,300 or so.
I think it was 2,300. I think they cut it at 23 as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, tell me your takes.
Okay, I have a fair amount of takes on this. I will say also, I haven't checked this morning, but one thing to be aware of is a 0.911 mint, and it is now at 3 ETH. So this is an interesting thing.
Well, that's the floor, and I always want to be careful. Like, I almost could see people who bought this being like, you know what? Fuck you.
Yeah.
I'm doubling down.
Yeah, well, that's
I'm
true.
not listening.
That's a good point. Like,
it doesn't mean anybody's buying it for that. It means that people are listing it for that.
Well,
I'll check right now and see if anybody actually has bought it.
People are buying it at that. Yeah, you should check it out real quick. Yes, they are. In fact, people are really pissed because they sold the bottom and it's been being sold at that. So, but I'll tell you what I think is happening, and if we can get into
immediately after it was like 0.9. It was down immediately after, and now it seems like it's pumped again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Okay, so right now it's actually at 0.195 ETH. So it's
it is?
It's very volatile right now, apparently.
What?
On OpenSea, the floor is 1.949, so basically 2.
Oh my God. Oh, okay. Almost 2 ETH.
Almost 2 ETH.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, 1.9. Yeah, if I said that wrong, sorry. It's 1.949.
Okay.
So it's basically 2. It's basically 2.
So my take on this is that in general, this is kind of following the path of a lot of other brand plays that have happened lately. And I think another one that kind of pairs nicely with this is the Game of Thrones mint, right? If you remember that, are you familiar with that?
I do remember that very much.
Yes.
I'm going to be curious to hear your analogy because give me your analogy.
Okay, here's my analogy goes back to what I was saying before, which is people in this space who want to enter it need to bring people onto their teams who understand what this space is.
Then yes, I totally agree with that.
And I think so in this instance, you have a very big luxury brand, which there are a lot of giant fans in this space of, by the way. There are a lot of people I knew in this space that were excited about this mint. I thought the minute I saw that it was a 0.911 mint and it was a 7,500 supply, I was out. There was no way that was going to work. And here's why. If you want to be a luxury brand and you want to do this right, my take on what this would have been is 0.911 at 1,000, because then you get your 1,000 true fans. You're going to get a lot of people that can come in here and be excited about owning it. Because I think there probably are that many people who would really buy into what Porsche is going to deliver for this. Now, I don't know exactly A, what they promised, or B, what people are expecting to get out of it, but it's definitely not art, right? If you look at this, these are all basically the exact same. It's not an art play. I assume this is some sort of a really interesting play if you're a giant fan of the brand, that it's an access mint. I don't know enough about it, but I can just tell you the minute I saw the supply and the price, I knew this was a big mistake. So I think what needed to happen is somebody in the marketing department at Porsche, or whoever, the agency or whoever did it, and this is why I think in part it's like Game of Thrones, I think there are agencies that are going to these companies and saying, hey, there's a really cool opportunity in Web3. We can build your brand in this space. And the companies often are like, great, go do that. And we'll trust you to go do that. And they're trusting the wrong people to do it. And I think if anything else, there needs to be an agency. My take is there's a world where you could create an agency in this world, in the Web3 world, of people who know what they're doing and help these companies onboard into this space better. Because again, my thing is, price is not that crazy for what is Porsche, right? It's a very luxury brand. Like, why wouldn't you have an expensive NFT because you're going to promise that they're going to get something back? What you have to know, though, is at a 7,500 supply in this market, you are dead in the water. And I think that's the information they never got, and somebody should have given it to them way earlier.
You know, I think it can be very hard sometimes to know when something misses because they totally screwed the thing up. And when something misses for kind of more intangible sentiment reasons, like I think there are other brands that could have in many ways resembled this and it could have been less disastrous, or in a different time period, it would have been less disastrous.
Yeah, of course.
On and on and on and on and on. So I think you're saying some of that. And I think that's right. I think the 7,500 supply was totally wrong. I mean, what's so funny to me is, I mean, how many cars a year does Porsche sell? I just interviewed Lamborghini. Unfortunately, I interviewed them before this Porsche thing happened, so I wasn't able to ask them at all about it. That'll be coming out probably next week, my interview with Lamborghini, or in 2 weeks, I guess. And I mean, Lamborghini, I know because I had just been doing the research. Like, you know, they sold more cars than they've ever sold in a single year last year, and they sold 9,000 vehicles, right? So, like,
oh my God, is that right? I had no idea. That's fascinating.
Fascinating, right? I had no idea either. They sell, like, in a usual year, Lamborghini will sell like 3,000 cars. Like, wow. The supply on their actual vehicles are so small. And I get that they're thinking NFTs is a way to broaden the base because most people can't afford a Lamborghini, but there's more people who are fans of the brand that can afford the car. And so this is a way to tap into those people. But it still seems, it's like, grow it slowly, to your point. Like, it seems like it should be the most intuitive thing in the world for these brands to say small supply. That's what the brand is. Bring that vibe to this. I think in addition to the supply problem, they just had cringy marketing out the gate.
Yep.
And a couple, the big two examples that people have been flagging that I think are exactly right are, first of all, they got the handle at @ETH_Porsche. Like, they didn't buy Porsche.
Like yeah, exactly. It's pretty crazy.
Where you're like, what? You know what I mean? Like way to like show that you spent 2 minutes in crypto Twitter without ever making like a real effort to know it. Mm-hmm. And then there was another line here that I want to read out that I think that was from their press release. That just sounded like, you know, your dad being like, are you on the Facebook? Are you on the Twitter? You know? And the line was, as usual in the Web3 scene, it is possible to register in advance on an allow list. Like, it was just this weird,
oh my God,
like, as is usual in the Web3 scene, right, guys?
Are we sure that's not ChatGPT? Maybe they found a way to use that.
It probably was.
Yeah.
It was just so weird. And like, again, your dad is like, you know, talking to you about some hip lingo thing. So I think that was also part of it too, was just like not setting the cultural scene. Now, on the flip side, they unveiled this at Art Basel in Miami. Like, they didn't, I don't think this whole thing was like entirely a whiff. It's so striking to me that the floor price is, and you're right, people are buying it right now for over an ETH, for almost 2 ETH. I mean, the luxury car, sports car world is it does make a lot of sense here. And one of the things that feels like a no-brainer, and I talk about this with Lamborghini, is, you know, again, they're only selling 3,000, 5,000, 9,000 vehicles a year. What they're offering is very high touch service. Yep. To their audience. So when you talk about what does a loyalty program look like for a luxury car business, it's quite literally like you can get somebody on the phone from HQ because there's not that many people. Yeah. It's super high touch. And so I think there's an opportunity to bring elements of that, the experiential side. It's inviting, you know, Lamborghini's going to invite their 6,000 collectors to the unveiling and the opening of their new car at their new facility in wherever in Europe that's fancy, right? Like, because you can. And so there's an opportunity to bring that culture into the experiences you offer to your NFT community. I think because people got so negative on it, then they read everything negatively and were like, oh, the roadmap's too ambiguous. And you're like, no, this is actually pretty common to kind of say something ambiguous about experiences. I haven't written them off yet. If they can, there's such a no-brainer play here for luxury and sports cars that I'm hopeful. I'm rooting for them to figure it out, while acknowledging, oversupply, like weird, cringy language in the in the press release. There's also an interesting thing that somebody flagged on Twitter that I think is really important to call out. I think this is right.
I saw this, I think,
the language about you can return it.
Yeah.
You have like 14 days to return this NFT for a full refund.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing I think that's fascinating about that is they're using, and I think this is something that may be a larger issue going forward, is they're using a law in the EU that is consumer protective. And I think this is something in the NFT space people are going to have to be aware of, because we are not a localized, in America, there are much looser laws, but in the EU, this is why you have a lot of issues with Google and Microsoft and competition in the EU that kind of spill back into America. It's an international company, an international brand. So it'll be interesting to see if those basically from what I read, the EU law is that there is a world in which you have 14 days to return it for the mint price. Now, the funny thing is at this point, it's over mint, so no one's going to do that. But the question would be is how long does that last going forward? Because in the tweet thread, there was a sense that like, oh, maybe there's a world that would have to last later than 14 days. There's one more thing I wanted to say about this kind of idea of small supply utility-driven stuff. I want to shout out Gary V, who is a great person in this space, understands it well. The very first VFriends mint, which was way back when, and this is, VFriends 2 is a wholly different thing. I think he was trying to expand it out in a much bigger way. The very first VFriends mint was almost entirely about connective tissue and utility to him. Say what you will about Gary V's art. I don't think it's like designed to be like the most high-level art in the world. He drew Doodles, right? But the idea is that as a person who is a fan of his brand or a connective person to his brand, he was going to provide these unique experiences. And that's why the value went up. And I think what you're saying about the opportunity here at small supply, utility-driven things for like the Uber Porsche fan, my take is if they had a real delivery device on what would be interesting and they capped this at 1,000, I could see these going 5, 10, 15 ETH, right? Because those are the big luxury buyers, people who own Porsches and love Porsche. They're going to want to be part of that club. And this brand feels like they could do it well. I just think the way they approached it and speaking, marketing and all this stuff, nobody told them this stuff ahead of time. Like that if you had kind of laid these things out, the success plan would have been much easier than to try to dump it on the market like this.
Yep, I agree. Last thing and we'll move on. I think we're doing okay. I just don't want to ever scare these folks away. Like I'm like, I want Porsche in here. I want Porsche to do well. Like I do not want us all dancing on the grave. This clearly is not dead. It's selling for more. Like of these brands who come in and do it wrong. Like let's like gently tell them how to do it right. I thought last week we talked about the National Geographic debacle, which I think was way more of a disaster, frankly, than even Porsche was. There was a lot there that was really kind of a mess. But I almost felt bad. Like I was like sensitive to wanting to not be like overly mean about it. Cause I'm like, thank you. I'm glad you're trying something. Like, you know what I mean? Like I want to like, be gentle and be like, yes, come a little deeper in. Like, it's not so scary. Water's warm. Like do it better next time. Because I don't think it's helpful to any of us if these brands get scared away because we all just scream at them that they're idiots.
I mean, my thing is we need to see a couple succeed, right? Like that's the thing where, and I'm sure there have been, and I know that I'm not.
Starbucks, Nike, Reddit, Instagram. Exactly. Like you have the players who are doing it well.
Yeah. But if they succeed, then it will feel like safer space to play in, I feel like. And I think that's what you need at this point.
Yep. Okay. Speaking of safe spaces, not safe spaces, and we'll do only 2 more topics. We have so much we could talk about, but I do want to be mindful of time. The Kevin Rose wallet hack. This is a heartbreaker. It's very sad.
It's a bummer.
Heartbreaker.
It's a real bummer. I mean, my take on it is I think it's, and I don't know all the details. There was a small thread that Kevin retweeted yesterday. I think more details are going to come out today. But I think the biggest note of this for me is make sure if you have valuable assets, to spread them into multiple wallets because you never really know. And I think the other thing that comes down to this, like this is what happens with the apes all the time. Social engineering is often how these things happen, right? And if you're not familiar with that, it's brutal. It can be really brutal.
There are some terrifying examples of social engineering, and just to put a fine point on exactly what that is, it's like these people who gain your trust. I mean, this was somebody, it sounds like, who like gained Kevin's trust for some sort of over-the-counter trade. That's what we're inferring here based on some of these tweets, that then drained his wallet and had something nefarious in the code. And I mean, I retweeted, this was many months ago, but there are some advanced social engineering schemes going on. Somebody retweeted one that they almost got themselves caught in that was crazy when you read. It was like a long con, right? This is like months people spend in Discord phishing you, participating, just building a backstory for themselves that is so believable, only to then fish and attack you. The other thing that I want to like the UX is awful here, as we all know, right? And like, I'll give an example recently. So I recently, a couple weeks ago, moved basically all of my assets into cold storage because I was like, I'm being a little fast and loose here. I wasn't using it from a Mint wallet, but still, they just felt like they were out there. But then there was some claim the other day for like a Meebit. If you had a Meebit, you could do a claim. And like my Meebit's in my ledger. Like, okay, so now I have to go like get my ledger to transfer it to another wallet to risk taking the claim to transfer it back. Like that's like awful. So it's like, it's not even just, they're in my ledger because I don't have to, I'm not going to mint from that wallet ever. And I feel safe with them in there. But if you ever want to claim, and this is of course what Token Proof does. And this is why everyone should be using Token Proof. We use Token Proof when we do our live token gated events. Like one I just did, you have your OPJ NFT and then you connect through Token Proof to get onto the stream itself, because it's just not, nobody should be connecting to anything with their actual wallet at this point.
And again, it goes back to that same thing we were talking about before about centralization versus decentralization. Like, I believe very strongly in decentralization and why it's important in this space, but also bad actors, regulation, like there's all these kind of like conversations that come up. The one thing I'll say that I've found over time, and by the way, I'm not an expert at this, but I just make flat out don't do over the counter trades. And I know that's hard, but partly like you're dealing with Kevin's assets and with punks and things like that. A lot of times the sales happen there because it's people that have come together and they're two people with a lot of money, or somebody's got a very expensive thing and somebody doesn't. And I just am a fan of like, okay, if you want to do something, we go through a marketplace, right? Like in a trusted marketplace. Like I don't sell anything to somebody privately. It's just not the world that I live in. It's not something I do because I just seen too many things go bad.
OpenSea was connected to this in some way? Did you see there was something?
Yeah, actually, this is a good point. I don't know exactly what the deal is, and this is why like I don't want to speak too succinctly on it because I don't know the whole detail. Most of these social engineering things you hear about have to do with either over-the-counter trades or like I think there's a lot of people who like, hey, I could do this cool thing with your ape, like animate your ape, click through and I'll do it here, and they click through. This one might be more complicated, and knowing Kevin, it probably is because he's not going to fall for something like that. So, right. But in general, social engineering, like you said, is really about con people developing relationships over time. And I'm sure you've had this experience I have with my mom where she's like, hey, I talked to this person who says they're this. And I'm like, Mom, every person that contacts you don't know online is probably bad. And this is the shitty thing about living in this life. Exactly. And so you just have to assume anybody who you don't have a personal relationship is a bad person that approaches you in DMs especially. You also kind of have to assume that even if you have developed a relationship, if you don't know them IRL, if you haven't shared something with them, it's sketchy. It can be sketchy. So I think
I'm so paranoid at this point. Like, and I haven't been trading much because it's sort of been, things have been dead for a little while. Like I was saying this last week, like I sold my first thing recently, I haven't been selling recently, and I was terrified signing. Like I was like, I am so at this point scared. And I'm like, this is healthy. Like, this is not healthy. This can't continue because it just makes me I don't want to do anything. I just want to have the bags I have and just hold and just like, I never want to touch anything because I'm so paranoid at this point. And this is before Kevin got hacked.
Well, and you're an expert. This is the thing.
I'm like, I know this stuff. Like, and I'm like, when I sold my thing, I literally moved it to a totally fresh wallet and sold it out of a totally fresh wallet. Because I was just like, which is over the top. And I should be more of an expert to know, like, I don't have to do that. And I know I don't have to do that, but I was just so freaked. I'm just so scared at this point. So, okay, last thing, all of this, the who do you trust, what is reality, all gets worse with AI. I want to close this AI talk because I know are really interested in this, and I wanted to get your thoughts on some of this in terms of how it intersects with NFTs and what the opportunity here is.
Okay, so I am very, very fascinated with AI, and not when I say AI, I think there's different ways of looking at this. So like AI as a machine learning institution has been worked on for like 5 to 10 years in the past. Like it really all started, a long time ago with like the larger companies, and OpenAI has kind of blown everything up in recent, weeks, really, maybe a month now with ChatGPT, right? So everybody is keeping their eye on ChatGPT. The interesting thing that's also happening is if you've been following it, it all started with OpenAI again, came out with DALL-E 2, but now there are Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, which are allowing people to create art that is really pretty incredible art from kind of nothing. And just to be completely clear, like I actually have experimented enough in this and did a very small kind of side art project myself called Old Men with White Beards and created a small NFT collection using AI. And it was really fun. And it's been like a cool experiment to do. And I think the one thing I wanted to say about how AI is working in this space right now is, in the same way that we were talking earlier about how certain animators were really kind of against NFTs, there's this really interesting friction going on right now in the NFT space about AI artists and non-AI artists. And I want everybody in this podcast, whoever listens to it, to make sure you follow Claire Silver, Claire Silver is one of the best artists, period, working in the NFT space, but is an AI artist. She's a punk holder, and you'll see her punk in her
pink-haired
her pink-haired punk. But she's really great about talking about what's interesting about this technology and what makes it interesting. On the broader level, what's fascinating about this to me, and I also have non-NFT projects I'm working on. This is a small plug, but friends of mine and I made a game called Prompto, which is a almost like Wordle-like version of an AI. It's like Wordle AI using images, but go to promptogame.com and check it out. That's a small plug. I think what's going to happen overall in this space is AI is coming, and it's going to make the tools of creation way easier for everybody. So if you're old enough, and Carly, I'm not sure if you are, but to remember when YouTube first started in the mid 2000s, you were around, but
I was around.
Yeah,
I remember some of the early. Some of these early videos that are so lame now that went viral just because there was a dearth of supply of videos.
Exactly.
Hello, here's the world. Very nice Earth, you might say. Some of those early, yeah.
Well, and part of it is, so my take on this is what was interesting about UGC, which is what, originally came out of social media and YouTube, was that it was a lot of shit, right? It was a lot of crap but there was a lot of it, right? And there was a lot of it. And so when there's a lot of it, stuff bubbles up that's really interesting. And then it matures over time to where you suddenly now have tens of thousands of interesting creators making really cool stuff. And the big change there was you went from needing to have a television studio or needing to have a big video camera to having a phone or to having a DSLR and maybe some simple lighting setups. What's going to happen next is all of those tools that those people do, that's going to expand out to a much larger audience because you're going to need the ability to access these AI programs, and content is going to skyrocket. I'm a big believer that we're going to see within probably the next year, animated videos at least, if not larger movies, being made entirely by prompts, right? And that's a crazy thing to think about. And in general, I just think it's one of the most exciting things happening. I think it's as big as... This sounds insane. It's at least as big as Web 2. It might be as big as Web 1, because in some ways, Web 1 was about connection and about how we connect to each other and about information connecting. This is literally about how we're computing stuff, how our brains compute. It's how other things compute. It's about ideas. And that is insanely revolutionary when you really dig into how it's going to change the planet, I think. I'm
trying to, and I have not succeeded in this, but I'm trying to every day use a piece of AI for something. I'm finding it's mostly chat GPT stuff, hey, write this job description for me initially. And for the most part, I have not been nailing it, right? Because I'm okay, I actually just know more than you know about what I need. And it's not even that helpful of a starting point, sort of helpful as a starting point. But I definitely am excited about some of the video creation stuff or video editing tools. My sense is they're not really quite there yet. I have a saved tab of some of it. There's a new feature in I guess the latest NVIDIA graphics card or something that allows you to look like you're making eye contact with the camera while you look
I saw
away.
that. Yeah.
I put that on my calendar for this weekend to try and grab that and figure out how to integrate it and use it, because that is something that's really, I think about that a lot, because there are times where this is a very off the cuff podcast. I think that makes it great. There are times I'd love to script things, but we use video and we have a YouTube, and it looks awful if you're just reading a script and it doesn't feel authentic. So I'm definitely interested in playing around with that technology. Hopefully not too many people listen to this, this particular episode, or they're going to know in the future what I'm doing, I'm giving away all my secrets. But yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff. And that's an AI, kind of back end powered tool. So I want to just, as much as I can, integrate it into the processes I'm already doing. Yeah. Because I generally agree. I'm such a fan of, I don't know, I have to be in something before I make a determination about it. And I have not gotten the value out of AI enough yet to feel like I fully know. But intuitively, it makes so much sense. I believe all these people who are saying that this is likely where this is all going, and it seems probably a no-brainer.
100%. And I think just to bring it back to where we are in NFTs with it right now, just be aware, if you're on the DGen side like I am, so many of these projects that are coming out now are pretty shitty rugs, right? And I think that if, you see a lot of good art's made by AI, and just be aware that like there's a lot of people doing shady stuff because now they can do it. And that's the downside of it, right? Like when you have money attached to this, you're seeing a lot of people mint things out that may or may not be genuinely interesting as a project, or may not have anything else to it. And that's the downside of art being easier to do in some ways. It's an art to do this art well. It's really hard. But it's like the kind of interesting kind of dynamic of like, when it becomes easier to be an artist, and I'm not saying all these people are artists, some people are and some people aren't. When it becomes easier to be an artist, it's a lot more shit to pick through, in the same way that on YouTube, when anybody can make a show, it's a lot more shit to pick through as well.
Yep. Gavin, thank you so much for joining me today. Would love to have you back to do this again. It was very fun. And I don't know, you want to shout out where folks can find you? Should folks follow Funky Donk? Or
I think so. I think people who are listening to this podcast should follow at Funky Donk. It's as it sounds, it's spelled. And you can follow me on my normal handle, which is at Gavin Purcell. It's been around since 2007, so I'm an OG Twitter user. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm probably in Discords that I'm in. I still am in like 30 Discords, so I'm sure I will cross over with people that listen to the space. But feel free to reach out. I always love talking to people about this stuff, and I have a weird take on it versus, people that kind of come from different places. I always think that like there's so many financial people in this space, and this is not my background. It's an interesting, like, kind of weird thing for me to come from a full-blown creative side and kind of interact with financial people, because it's just not where I come from. And I do want to shout out, as this is a Bankless connected podcast. I think it still is, right?
Yes.
I want to thank the Bankless guys for shouting out at Funky Donk on one of their episodes recently, because I tweeted about something about the Game of Thrones NFT, about the big fingers ones, and that was fun to hear those guys say my name.
Oh, that's funny.
On Bankless, yeah.
The reason I don't know if I'm looking at the right project on OpenSea, but you were comparing the Game of Thrones and Porsche. I almost want to give like a little bit more credit to Porsche. Like, I feel like the Game of Thrones really was like just lowest effort.
Yes.
I don't want to. Yes.
Yeah. My big thing, just so we're clear on that, is I think both of those projects
were poorly advised to some extent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that they needed to be better connected to people who are in the space that could understand. I think the Game of Thrones was much more egregious. I think that the opportunity there that was lost was massive, because, by the way, speaking of AI art, if they had just made really awesome AI art portraits of Game of Thrones characters, it would have crushed, and they would, maybe not it would have crushed, but like they had so many chances to do something interesting there, and it's just a real bummer to me that it failed.
And again, this is where I struggle, because it's Warner, right? Ultimately, I mean, it's like HBO, Warner, like, and I feel like everything Warner, like, I want to give credit to Warner for having done they've done a bunch of stuff. They've had a bunch of their IP in Web3, but it just all does end up feeling kind of cash grabby and kind of like a merch extension, or like they have this Palm connection, and so everything's on Palm, and it doesn't. I don't know. It's that mixed feelings of like, I appreciate that they're here. I want them to keep being here. Good for them for, to some extent, trailblazing. And yet I just want it to be a little bit better every time.
But not even a little bit better. It has to be good. And it was bad. Yeah. That's the thing that's shocking to me. Like, if it had been mediocre, fine. But like, not only was it not good, it was messed up.
Bad.
They like actually messed up the animation and published it. You know what I mean? So like, those are the dumb things. Like, you just wonder, like, well, who's looking at this, right? Who's where? Anyway, I could talk about that forever.
All right, Gavin. Well, yeah, we have to eventually stop this because I have a meeting in 5 minutes that I gotta hop to. But we'll definitely have you back on. I love getting the creative perspective. I love people coming from the entertainment worlds. John Rogers and I are going to start doing something a little bit more regularly around sort of entertainment in Hollywood, and folks might know him from my show. He's been on a couple of times. He's great. So we'll have you on there, and have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Overpriced JPEGs. If you liked this conversation, if you liked this episode, please go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps me out, it helps the show out, and it means you will get alerts and updates when we post new content. Thanks again.